The smell hit her first. Not the clean antiseptic odor she'd expected from a containment vessel. Something older, thicker, like iron-rich soil after rain, and the faint ghost of something burned. Dr. Mara Chen stood in the center of the holding cell and breathed it in slowly, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything. As data. The cell was 8 meters by 8 meters. The walls were a material she didn't have a name for, not quite ceramic, not quite stone, with a faint blue-gray iridescence that pulsed, barely perceptibly, in rhythm with something she couldn't hear. The floor was warm beneath her feet. The ceiling was high and curved, like the inside of a skull. She'd been on the station for 6 hours. She knew this because she still had her watch. They hadn't taken anything from her. That was the first thing that had bothered her, the meticulous, almost apologetic care with which she'd been transported. No restraints, no blindfold. Her bag was sitting against the wall by the door. Laptop, field recorder, 2 notebooks, the photograph of Elliot she always carried, all of it intact. The second thing that bothered her was the door. It wasn't locked. She'd checked it 20 minutes after waking up in the cell, pressed her palm flat against what seemed like a seam in the wall, and the whole panel had simply retracted, opening onto a corridor of the same iridescent material, curved and warm and softly lit by something she couldn't locate. She'd stood there for a long moment looking at it. Then she'd come back inside and sat down cross-legged on the floor and thought very carefully about what that meant. It meant they wanted her to stay, not because they'd caged her, but because they'd offered the illusion of freedom and expected her to be too afraid to use it. Or it meant the corridor led nowhere useful. Or it meant something she hadn't thought of yet. She opened her laptop, not because there was any signal, there wasn't, but because the act of opening it, of settling her fingers on the keys, was the thing she did when she needed to think. She'd been doing it since she was 22 and writing her doctoral thesis on xenolinguistics in a 1-room apartment in Edinburgh, and 6 years of field work and 3 alien contact events and 1 catastrophic loss hadn't broken the habit. She typed, "They didn't lock the door." Then why? She was still working through the answer when the visitor arrived. It came through the wall. Not through the door, through the wall, which simply parted for it the way water parts for a hand, the iridescent surface flowing around its body and closing behind it without a seam. It was tall, nearly 3 meters, hunched slightly as though it had learned to make itself smaller in rooms built for other species. Its skin, if it was skin, was a deep charcoal gray, with a texture like overlapping scales that didn't quite catch the light the way scales should. Its face was broad and flat, with 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc, each a different depth of amber, and a mouth that was too wide, currently closed, running nearly ear to ear if it had ears, which it didn't. It stood at the far wall and looked at her with all 4 eyes. Mara looked back. Neither of them moved for almost a full minute. Then she said, "You're Veth." It wasn't a question. She'd read every report from the Kepler-12 contact event, every translated fragment, every linguistic analysis. The species called itself the Vethkar in full, which the first contact team had shortened to Veth. Their body language, as much as it could be decoded, communicated through the micro-movements of those scale-like structures. A ripple that moved outward from the center of the chest when they were processing something unexpected. The one standing in front of her was rippling now, very slightly. "You are not afraid," it said. Its voice was a low resonance that she felt more in her sternum than heard with her ears, and the language it spoke was not English, but she understood it anyway, which told her she was wearing a translation implant she hadn't consented to and hadn't known about. She filed that away. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not performing it for you." Another ripple. She was starting to read them as something like surprise, though she wasn't confident enough to commit to that interpretation. "You looked at the door," it said. "I opened the door," she said, "and then I came back inside. There's a difference." It was quiet for a moment, Then you came back. I wanted to know why it was unlocked. And I haven't figured it out yet. She set her laptop aside. Are you going to tell me, or is this the part where you explain how insignificant humanity is in the grand scope of the galaxy? Another ripple, and this one was different, slower, longer. It moved from chest to shoulder and back, and the quality of it was not surprise. She thought, she wasn't sure, it might have been something like amusement. You were not supposed to come back inside, it said. So the corridor does go somewhere. Yes. And you expected me to run. All of them run. She looked at it, all of who? The silence that followed was a different kind. The kind she'd learned, in 6 years of contact work, to recognize as the moment when the other side of the table decided whether to tell the truth. She stayed very still and let it happen. Sit down, it said finally. What I have to tell you will take some time. Its name, it told her, was Sorketh. It held a rank that translated roughly as acquisitions broker, which in the Vethkar social structure meant it operated in the space between the legal and the illegal, sourcing materials and beings for parties that needed things quietly obtained and even more quietly delivered. It was, in a human word, a trafficker. It did not say this with shame. It said it with the flat affect of someone describing a profession, the way a plumber describes pipes. It had purchased her from a subnetwork operating out of the fringe colonies of the Kepler-12 system, where 3 humans had gone missing over the past 8 months. She was the third. The first 2 had been researchers like her. The second had been a linguist named Dr. Harmon Weir, who had been Mara's colleague at the Institute, and who she had reported as missing to every relevant authority, receiving in return the institutional equivalent of a shrug. Sorketh had purchased her for 43 units of something it called deep cycle credit, which it said was a significant sum. It had intended to release her. That was the plan. Acquire her before she could be sold further into the interior, transport her to a point within range of human space, put her in an escape pod with her belongings, and send her home. It was not altruism, it told her. It was risk management. Humans, it had calculated, were going to cause problems, and it preferred not to be in the chain of provenance when that happened. So let me go, Mara said. The corridor is still open. I'm not running yet because I want to know about Harmon. Sorketh went very still. The scales on its chest stopped moving entirely, which she was starting to think was the equivalent of an intake of breath. The other human, she said, the linguist, he was taken 8 months ago. Where is he? He is not on this station. Where is he? Sorketh looked at her with all 4 amber eyes. The scales began moving again, slowly, with a pattern she didn't recognize. I did not purchase him in time, it said. She didn't ask what that meant. She already knew what it meant. She just needed a moment with it, the way you need a moment with a thing you already knew was true but had been refusing to confirm. She took the moment. Then she said it somewhere quiet inside herself and came back. Show me what you have, she said. Records, whatever you collected about the network that took him, anything. You should leave. You unlocked the door, she said, which means you're giving me a choice. I'm making it. I'm not leaving until I see what you have. Sorketh was still for a long time. Then it extended one long arm, 4-jointed, the proportions slightly wrong in a way that made her eyes want to slide off it, and pressed the back of a claw-tipped hand against a section of wall. The section dissolved, and behind it was what she could only describe as a camera, except it wasn't a camera. It was a Vethkar recording device, a glyph sphere, about the size of a melon, dark and faceted, and when Sorketh picked it up and placed it in the center of the floor between them, it began to emit something that was not quite light and not quite sound, but existed in some register that her translation implant managed to render into images. She watched. What she saw was not easy to watch. It was not meant to be. The glyph sphere was a surveillance record, not Vethkar surveillance, but the surveillance of the network that had taken her and Harmon and a third researcher she didn't recognize. The images showed a facility, showed what happened in the facility, showed who came to the facility to purchase what was in it, and she recognized two of those buyers as Vethkar, and one as something else entirely, something she had no name for, tall and pale and wrong in a way that made the translation implant stutter, as though even the technology couldn't quite resolve what it was looking at. She watched all of it, she didn't look away. When it was done, the glyph sphere went dark. Mara sat very quietly for a moment. Then she said, "How many humans are currently in that facility?" 14, Sorketh said, "as of the last record." "And where is the facility?" "Dr. Chen." "Where is it?" Another long silence. Sorketh crouched slightly, lowered itself, she realized, to be closer to her eye level, and the gesture was deliberate and careful in a way that landed differently than she'd expected. "You understand," it said, "that if you go there you will likely not come back. I understand that 14 people are in a facility that I have surveillance footage of, and that footage needs to get to humans who can do something about it. What I don't understand yet is whether you're willing to help me or whether you just wanted to clear your conscience." Sorketh looked at her. All four eyes, all four amber depths, and something moved through the scales of its chest that she hadn't seen before, a pattern that traveled up and out and didn't close, just dissipated like it had no name. "You came back through the door," it said. "Yes." "None of them come back." "I'm not none of them." A long pause. Then Sorketh set the dark glyph sphere on the floor between them and said, "I will show you what I have." What it had was considerable. She spent the next 4 hours going through it, not with Sorketh translating, but on her own, because she had 6 years of Vethkar linguistic immersion, and the translation implant they'd put in her was more sophisticated than the ones the contact teams used, calibrated not just for verbal language, but for the glyph script the records were kept in. It was the most useful thing they'd done to her without permission. She chose not to think too hard about that. The records went back 11 months. The network's Sorketh called it the Meridian Circuit, though it had no single name for itself, just a series of transaction codes, had been operating in the fringe space between human expansion and the outer Vethkar territories for nearly 2 years. It had started with materials, rare compounds, biological samples of the kind that were technically prohibited under the Kepler-12 Accord, but which existed in a gray market that neither species' governments wanted to acknowledge. Then somewhere around 14 months ago, it had shifted focus. Humans were more valuable than materials. This was not a philosophical statement, it was an economic one. The Meridian Circuit had discovered, and she read this with a precision that kept her anger from clouding her comprehension, that human neurochemistry was uniquely reactive to certain compounds used in Vethkar cognitive research. Something about the way human brains process stress hormones created a byproduct that didn't exist in Vethkar physiology, and which was extraordinarily expensive to synthesize and extraordinarily cheap to harvest. She stopped at that word, harvest. In the glyph script, it was the same character used for crops. She kept reading. The facility was called Station Yelmora in the records. It was positioned in a debris field about 12 light-years from human space, close enough to supply but far enough to be outside any patrol range either species maintained. The 14 humans currently registered there had been acquired over 8 months. 3 had been released. She noted the clinical term before they could be processed, which meant purchased by parties like Sorketh for extraction purposes. 2 of the 3 released were accounted for. She'd read about one, a biologist named Calder, who had appeared in a colony transport 6 months ago with no memory of the intervening period, and no explanation anyone had been able to pry out of him. The other was a materials engineer who hadn't made it home. The third was her. She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept reading. The buyers for the humans in the facility were listed by code, not name, but Sorketh had cracked 4 of the codes during its own investigation, and one of them was a name she recognized from the contact event reports. A Vethkar government contractor. Not a rogue actor. A contractor. She closed the record and looked up. Sorketh was at the far wall, arms folded in the Vethkar posture that she thought meant patient waiting. It had been patient for 4 hours. It was still patient now. "Someone in your government knows about this," she said. "Yes. That's why you wanted to extract me without a record." "I did not want to be in the chain of provenance," it said again, the same words as before, but she heard them differently now. "You're scared," she said. "Not of humans, of whoever's running this from your side." Sorketh looked at her for a long time. "The contractor," she said, "the one in your records, how high does it go?" "High enough that I am very aware of how much I have told you today," Sorketh said. She nodded. She understood that. She also understood something else, something she turned over carefully because she needed it to hold weight. She was sitting on a recording that documented 11 months of illegal human acquisition, with a partial list of buyers that included a Vethkar government contractor, and the only copy of that recording was the glyph sphere on the floor between her and an alien broker who had, by his own admission, purchased her as a preemptive liability management strategy. "I need that glyph sphere," she said. "It is the only copy." "I know." "If you take it back to human space," Sorketh said, "what happens will not be quiet." "No," she said, "it won't." Another long pause. The scales on Sorketh's chest moved in a long, slow wave she couldn't parse. "You could simply leave," it said. "You know the corridor is open. I would give you the escape pod. You would go home. You would tell your authorities that you were taken, that you were held, that you escaped. You would have no evidence of anything. It would be," it paused, searching for the word, "safer." "For who?" "For you." She looked at the glyph sphere on the floor. The thing about Harmon Weir was that she'd known him for 9 years. They'd met at a xenolinguistics conference in Reykjavik. She'd presented a paper on semantic drift in the early Vethkar translations. He'd argued with her about 3 of her core premises, and they'd ended up talking until 2 in the morning over terrible hotel coffee. He had a daughter. Her name was Priya. She was 7 years old. Mara had a photograph of Priya at Harmon's birthday party, the one they'd held at the Institute, and Priya was wearing a paper crown and laughing so hard she was blurring at the edges. Harmon was gone. She was not going to bring him back. 14 people were not gone yet. "I'm not leaving without that," she said, and nodded at the glyph sphere. Sorketh was still for a very long time. Then it said, "If I give you the sphere, I have nothing left to trade with. No evidence of my own cooperation. No protection." "I know. You are asking me to trust that humans will." "I'm not asking you to trust humans," she said. "I'm asking you to trust that if you don't give me that sphere, I am going to cause you significantly more trouble than the Meridian Circuit ever did, because I will walk out that corridor and I will find a way to make what I know known without any evidence at all, and your name will be in the story whether you want it there or not. Because I know your name. I know your rank. I know what you paid for me, and I know approximately where this station is positioned, and I have a field recorder in that bag that has been running since I woke up." The scales across Sorketh's entire body went perfectly, completely still. She held its gaze, all 4 amber depths, and didn't look away. "Or," she said, "you give me the sphere and you help me get to a human transmission relay, and I get this back to people who can use it. And when this comes out, and it will come out, there is one name on the correct side of the record. Yours." The silence was very long. The station made no sound she could consciously identify, but she was aware of the pulse of it, that faint rhythm in the walls, in the floor, in the air. And she breathed with it because she'd read somewhere that matching rhythm to an opponent's environment could signal calm, and she needed to signal calm very badly right now. "You recorded me," Sorketh said. "Yes. From the beginning." "Habit," she said. "I'm a field researcher. I record everything." Another still moment. Then slowly, the scales began to move again, not in any pattern she'd seen before, but in a ripple that started at the center of its chest and spread outward in all directions simultaneously, like a stone dropped in water. She thought she was almost certain it was laughter. "I bought you," Sorketh said, "to remove you from a situation before you could become a problem." "Yes." "This did not work." "No," she said, "it didn't." Sorketh looked at the glyph sphere for a long time. Then it crouched down in one fluid motion and picked it up and held it out to her. She took it. It was warm and the facets were smooth, and it sat in her palm like it weighed nothing. "The corridor," Sorketh said, "does not go to an escape pod." "I know. You said you unlocked it. You didn't say you'd parked a pod at the end of it." "There is a secondary docking ring on this station. It is not for escape pods. It is for," a pause, "acquisitions transport." "A ship," she said. "A small one. I use it for the final leg of extractions. It is faster than the pod, and it has a transmission array capable of reaching a human relay beacon." She looked at it. "You were going to use the ship to send me home anyway," she said. "Yes." "So nothing has actually changed." "Everything has changed," Sorketh said. "I was going to send you home with nothing. Now I am sending you home with evidence." "And you're not sending me, you're taking me." The scales moved again, that same water ripple pattern. "You are extremely inconvenient," it said. "Thank you," she said. The ship was small and fast and smelled of that same iron-rich burned smell as the station, and Mara sat in the co-pilot seat, because there was a co-pilot seat, and she asked permission, and after a long pause Sorketh said yes, and watched the debris field scroll past the forward port as they cleared the station's gravity well. She had her field recorder in her lap. The glyph sphere was in her bag, wrapped in a shirt, between the photograph of Elliot and one of her notebooks. She had been awake for what she estimated was over 30 hours. She had been a prisoner for 6 of them, and, for the 24 before that, had been in transit through the fringes of human space with an acquisition team she hadn't known was an acquisition team, until one of them had stopped pretending. She thought about the facility, Station Yelmora, the 14 people in it. "How long to a relay beacon?" she asked. 8 hours at current drive." She looked at the star field. "Can you go faster?" "No." "Okay." She set her field recorder on the console and pulled out one of her notebooks. "Then I'm going to need you to help me build a transmission package, something that goes with the glyph sphere, documentation that can be read on the human side without Vethkar translation tech." Sorketh glanced at her sideways. "You want me to help you build your case?" "You're invested in this case. Your name is in my recorder. Your cooperation is the thing that makes your name good in this story instead of bad." She opened the notebook and found a clean page. "And I think you know things about the meridian circuit that aren't in the glyph sphere." "That is possible." "So tell me." What Sorketh told her over the next 6 hours, she wrote down in longhand. Not because the recorder wasn't running, it was always running, but because writing things down the old way helped her hold the shape of them. Sorketh had been tracking the meridian circuit for 4 months before her acquisition. Not out of altruism. It said this repeatedly, as though concerned she would mistake it for something it wasn't, but because the circuit's activities in the fringe had begun to destabilize a legitimate trade network that Sorketh used, and destabilization was bad for business. In the course of tracking the circuit, it had accumulated records that went beyond the glyph sphere. Transaction logs, identification codes for 14 separate buyers, a partial organizational chart, and 3 recordings of communications between the contractor she'd identified and a second Vethkar party whose rank was high enough that Sorketh would only refer to it as the interior. The interior. She wrote it down and looked at it. That means it reaches into Vethkar governance, she said. It means it is possible that individuals with access to policy decisions have financial interests in the circuit's continued operation, Sorketh said, with the careful precision of someone who had thought very hard about exactly which words to use. That means your government is involved. It means individuals within certain structures may be involved. It would be inaccurate and inflammatory to characterize it as governmental. She looked at it. I'm a xenolinguist. I know what inaccurate and inflammatory means when a government contractor says it. Sorketh's scales moved. It means it would be better if your authorities can build the case themselves, with the evidence, rather than a characterization provided by me. Because you're trying to manage how this goes. I am trying to ensure this goes somewhere, it said, rather than being dismissed as the account of one human and one Vethkar broker with questionable credentials. She looked at the star field. She thought about what happened to cases that came in on a single witness with no institutional backing, and she thought about what happened to cases that came in with evidence, and she thought about the difference between the two. Okay, she said, what else? He told her about 3 of the buyers. One was a research institution, not government but government adjacent, the Vethkar equivalent of a contracted private lab, which meant the research had sponsors, and the sponsors had interests, and the interests had votes in certain bodies. One was an individual of significant wealth who collected, in Sorketh's careful language, things that were considered rare. The third was the pale, wrong-shaped thing she'd seen in the glyph-sphere footage, and Sorketh went very still when she asked about it and said only, "Not Vethkar, not from any species in the Accord. I do not know what it is. I have only seen it twice. Both times I left the transaction space as quickly as I could manage." "It scares you," she said. "Yes," said Sorketh, "it scares me." She wrote that down too. 2 hours out from the relay beacon, she asked Sorketh to slow the ship. "Why?" it said. "Because I need you to understand something before we get there, and I need you to be able to make a choice about it." Sorketh slowed the ship. The star field stilled. "When I transmit from that beacon," she said, "I am transmitting to the Institute. My institute, the Xenolinguistics and Contact Research Institute, which has a standing emergency protocol for contact events and an existing relationship with 3 human government defense bodies. What I send them is going to trigger a response, a significant one. That response is not going to be contained to the fringe. I understand this. The response is also going to include disclosure of your name, your role, your station's location, and your involvement in the circuit as both an extractor and an informant. I am going to characterize your involvement as cooperative and instrumental in recovering this evidence, because that is accurate, but your name will be in it." Sorketh was quiet. "I am giving you the chance to tell me," she said, "if there is anything you need me to know before I transmit, anything that changes the story, anything I don't have yet." She set her pen down and looked at it directly. The station was behind them, somewhere in the dark. The relay beacon was ahead. The pale, wrong-shaped thing from the footage was somewhere in the universe, and she didn't know where. "Why do you do this?" Sorketh asked. It was not an antagonistic question. It was, she thought, a genuine one, the question of a being trying to understand a behavior that did not fit its models. "Do what?" she said. "You were safe. You could have left. You had the corridor, you had the ship, you could have gone home. You had no evidence. You had nothing that obligated you to stay. And you stayed, and then you built a case. And now you are here 2 hours from a transmission that will make you," it paused, working through the right word, "visible, known, a target." "Yes," she said. "You understand that being visible will make you less safe." "I understand that." "Then why?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Harmon Weir and his daughter Priya in the paper Crown. She thought about 14 people in a facility called Station Yelmora. She thought about Elliot, who had died not in a facility but in a hospital, quietly and predictably, and whom she had held at the end, and who had said to her once, years before the end, that the worst thing he could imagine was someone suffering alone somewhere while people who knew walked past the door. She picked up her pen. 14 people, she said, that's why. Sorketh was very still. And the facility, she said. We need to talk about that. I don't have enough in the transmission to launch a rescue. I have enough to trigger an investigation, and an investigation takes time, and people in a facility that harvests neurochemicals don't have investigation time. So I need to know, is there anything in what you have that tells me how the facility is guarded? What kind of response it's set up to resist? Why? Because I'm going to need to give my people something they can move on, not just evidence of the crime, a way in. You said you were transmitting to researchers. I'm transmitting to an institute with relationships with 3 defense bodies, she said. I've been on 2 prior contact events. I know people. I know how to ask for things. Sorketh considered her for a long time. The facility, it said, is defended by 3 Vethkar security vessels, standard grade, not military. The debris field it's positioned in limits approach vectors to 2 corridors. The facility itself is not armed. It was built as a research station and the security is external. The internal staff is small. 14 humans require less management than you might think when they have been. It stopped. When they've been processed, she said. Yes. She wrote all of this down in careful, even handwriting, the way she'd been writing field notes since she was a postdoc. The voice had learned early to stay even when the content was not even. It was a skill. She was grateful for it now. Okay, she said, is there anything else? There is one more thing, Sorketh said. I have not told you because I was uncertain whether it was. Another pause, longer, useful or simply painful. She set her pen down. The second human researcher, it said, Dr. Weir. I said he was not available for extraction when I looked. This is true. But in the records, the Glyphsphere records, there are 14 hours of his time at the facility. He was at Station Yelmora. She looked at the star field. And he is not there now, she said. No. Where is he? I do not know, Sorketh said. The records show a transaction, a buyer, the same buyer who appears twice in the footage with the pale entity. The transaction code is one of the 4 I was not able to identify. She breathed in slowly, she breathed out. Okay, she said. I am sorry. She looked at Sorketh, all 4 amber eyes. I know, she said. She picked up her pen and wrote, Harmon buyer unknown, transaction linked to pale entity. Find buyer, find Harmon. She underlined it once. I'm ready, she said. Take us to the beacon. The transmission took 40 minutes to build and 6 seconds to send. It was the most compressed, precisely documented, source-cited transmission she'd ever composed, and she had composed over her career approximately 1,100 field reports. She included the Glyphsphere data converted to a readable format using the ship's translation array, Sorketh's verbal account timestamped from the field recorder, her own written documentation, facility specifications, guard configuration, approach vectors, buyer identification on 10 of the 14 codes, and a flag, red level, marked for immediate attention, directed to Director Hasegawa at the Institute, and simultaneously to the defense contacts she was not supposed to have but had accumulated over 2 contact events and 11 years in a field where knowing the right people was sometimes the difference between a first contact becoming a diplomatic relationship and becoming a war. She also included a personal addendum, encrypted for Hasegawa alone, 14 at Yelmora. Move fast. Also Harmon. Don't let anyone close this until we know where Harmon went. When the transmission confirmed, she sat back in the co-pilot seat and looked at the star field for a long time. Sorketh said nothing. She appreciated that. "How long to get back to human space?" she asked. "From here, 3 days at standard drive. And if someone picks up my transmission in the next hour, how long to reach the facility from the nearest human naval position?" "With the approach vectors specified, 6 hours. So they'll get there first," she said. "If they respond immediately, yes." She thought about 14 people. She thought about the approach corridors through the debris field and the 3 external security vessels and the small internal staff. She thought about Director Hasegawa, who was meticulous and thorough, and who would call the right people in the right order and who would not, if she knew the woman, waste time. She thought about what it felt like to walk back through a door you weren't locked behind, when leaving would have been easier. "Sorketh," she said. "Yes." "When we get to human space, what happens to you?" Sorketh was quiet for a moment. "I am uncertain." "You'll be interviewed. You'll have to give testimony. There will be people who don't trust you." "This is expected." "I'll tell them what you did, all of it, including the part where you bought me. I won't edit that." "I did not expect you to. But I'll also tell them what you gave me, and why. And that without you none of this gets home." She paused. "That matters. In human legal frameworks, cooperation matters, testimony matters. Being on record as the one who broke the case open matters." "I'm aware that this was the trade you offered," Sorketh said. "I'm not reminding you of the trade. I'm telling you I'll hold up my side of it." Another long pause. The ship moved through the dark. "You are strange," Sorketh said. It didn't sound like an insult. "So I've been told." "You walked back through the door," it said again. It seemed to be something it kept returning to, a data point it was still processing, still trying to classify. "Something worth staying for," she said. "That's all it takes. You just have to find something worth staying for." Sorketh was quiet for a long time after that. 3 days later, they crossed into human space at the outer marker of the Callaway Transit Corridor, and the first ship to hail them was an Institute vessel, not a military one, but a contact-class vessel, fast and lightly armed, with Dr. Hasegawa's face on the screen when Mara accepted the call. Hasegawa looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "You transmitted at a relay beacon 12 light-years out," she said finally. "Yes." "With evidence of an ongoing human trafficking operation involving at least one Vethkar government contractor." "Yes." "Mara," Hasegawa paused, "you were missing for 37 hours. "I know." "We thought," Hasegawa stopped. "Never mind what we thought." "What happened at Yelmora?" Mara asked. A brief silence. Then, 14 people, all alive, 3 in critical condition but stable. "The facility is secured." The 3 security vessels withdrew when the naval response arrived. They were not equipped for an engagement with a full tactical unit. Another pause. "They withdrew. They didn't fight." "No," Mara said. "They wouldn't. It was a commercial operation. Commercial operations cut their losses." "The buyer list." I know what's in it." Hasegawa looked at her for a long moment. "The Vethkar government has already issued a statement expressing concern about unauthorized activities in the fringe space." "Concern," Mara said. "Concern," Hasegawa confirmed. "Which is the diplomatic way of saying they're going to try to control this." "They can't control it, not with what's in that glyph sphere." "No," Hasegawa said. "They can't." She looked past Mara at the co-pilot seat, at Sorketh, four-eyed and very still and watching the exchange with the patient attention of someone who understood more than it was letting on. "Is that?" "Yes," Mara said. "Sorketh, acquisitions broker, Vethkar fringe operations, cooperative witness, instrumental in the recovery of this evidence and in my safe transit to the relay beacon." She paused. I gave a verbal guarantee of protected witness status pending formal process. I'd like that honored. Hasegawa looked at Sorketh. Sorketh looked at Hasegawa. I'll make the call, Hasegawa said. Thank you. Mara, Hasegawa's voice shifted, just slightly, that barely perceptible change in register that meant she was stepping out of director and into person. Are you all right? She thought about it honestly. She thought about the unlocked door and the decision she'd made in front of it. She thought about the glyph sphere footage and the face of the pale, wrong-shaped thing, and the name of a buyer she hadn't been able to identify, and a transaction code she was going to spend a very long time trying to crack. She thought about Harmon Weir and his daughter in a paper crown, laughing so hard she was blurring. She thought about 14 people who were alive. I will be, she said. Tell me about the 14. Hasegawa told her. She wrote it down, because she always wrote things down. The ship moved through human space with Sorketh at the helm, and outside the forward port the stars were the same stars that had hung over the worst night of her life and the best decision she'd ever made. The glyph sphere was in her bag, wedged between the photograph of Elliot and a notebook full of evidence that was going to change things. She had no idea yet what Harmon's buyer looked like up close, or where it had taken him, or whether it was something any human had ever categorized or named. But she had the transaction code. She had the link to the pale, wrong-shaped thing in the footage. She had 6 years of field work and a field recorder that had been running through all of it. She had something worth staying for. She opened a new page in her notebook and started writing. The first 14 names were easy. Hasegawa read them to her: 11 researchers, 2 communications engineers, 1 ship's medic who'd been on a supply run to one of the Kepler-12 fringe colonies when her vessel had been intercepted. The medic's name was Osai Bansu, and he was 44 years old, and he had been at Station Yelmora for 4 months. The naval unit had found him in a state that Hasegawa described as medically stable but disoriented, which Mara translated as 4 months of neurochemical extraction, leaving a person with only the rough outlines of who they'd been before. She wrote down all 14 names, their fields, their last known positions. Then she turned to the back of the notebook and started a second list which had 1 entry, Harmon Weir, and under that, Pale Entity Buyer, Transaction Code 7 Meridian Keth 44 null. She looked at the code for a long time. The code suffix, she said, null, is that standard? Sorketh looked over from the helm. No, null suffix means the transaction destination was deliberately obfuscated. The buyer did not want to trace route. Can it be unobfuscated? Not by me. The only records that would allow it are held by the circuit itself, and the circuit's central ledger was at Station Yelmora. If your naval unit secured the facility, they may have the ledger. She looked at Hasegawa on the screen. The facility's data cores, she said. Did the unit pull them? That question, Hasegawa said carefully, is being handled by people with clearances above my current briefing. Which meant yes, they'd pulled them, and the answer was now in a room Mara didn't have a key to. She thought about 14 people who were alive. She thought about the 14th who wasn't accounted for. I want access to those cores, she said. Mara. I have a field recorder with 6 hours of Sorketh's account on it, including details about the buyer structure that your cleared people are not going to have context for without a xenolinguistics specialist. She paused. I'm the only xenolinguistics specialist who was inside the circuit's operational chain and came out the other side with documentation. You need me in the room. Hasegawa looked at her for a long time, then she said, I'll make the call. It was the second time she'd said that in 10 minutes. It meant she was thinking, not stalling. Mara turned back to the star field. Sorketh had not spoken during this exchange. It had done what it had been doing for most of the journey, held course, watched the instruments, and processed in whatever way Vethkar processed things, those scale movements running their quiet internal commentary. She watched it for a moment. "The pale entity," she said, "the one you saw twice, both times at Yelmora. Once at Yelmora, once at a secondary transaction point on the outer rim of the Kepler-12 system, a place called the Orvan Exchange." "What did it buy?" "Both times." Sorketh was quiet for a moment. "At Yelmora it purchased 2 humans. At the Orvan Exchange it purchased something I do not have a word for, a biological structure, preserved." "From a human." A pause. "I could not determine the species." She wrote that down. "The Orvan Exchange, that's a known market. Known to those who operate in the fringe, not registered with any governing body." "And after the exchange, the pale entity, where did it go?" "There are no tracking records I could access. It departed. It did not use a known transit corridor. The drive signature was not Vethkar, not human, not anything in the Accord's registry." She stopped writing and sat with that. Not Vethkar, not human, not anything in the Accord's registry. There were 37 species in the Kepler-12 Accord. 17 of them were fully registered with transit signatures on file. The other 20 were either too small or too newly contacted to have full registry integration, but they were known. The Accord had a biological catalog. It had a drive signature database. It had been maintained for 22 years by the Joint Commission that ran the contact infrastructure. If a species wasn't in it, either they were new, so new that no contact team had logged them, or they were deliberately absent, which meant either unknown or hiding. Neither option was comfortable. "When the pale entity spoke," she said, "did it use a translation system?" "It did not speak." She looked up from the notebook. "At all." "It communicated through the transaction interface, text-based. The text was in standard trade glyph, which is the common written form for interspecies commerce in this region, but it never produced sound." "Could you tell if it was using a translation interface, or generating the glyphs itself?" Sorketh considered. The latency was very low, lower than a translation system would produce. If it was translating, the system was significantly more advanced than anything in common use. She wrote generates trade glyph natively or near natively, silent, unknown drive signature, not in Accord registry. She looked at the list. It was a description of something that had been moving through Vethkar fringe space for at least as long as the Meridian Circuit had been operating, buying humans in a market that traded in illegal goods, and leaving no trace that any existing system could follow. That was a problem of a different order than 14 people in a facility. She didn't say this to Sorketh. She didn't need to. The Vethkar broker had clearly arrived at the same conclusion some time ago, because it had been careful in all of its 6 hours of testimony never to refer to the pale entity as anything other than the pale entity. No species name, no pronoun, no guessing, just the thing I cannot identify and which frightens me and which I have seen twice and which I prefer very much to never see again. She respected that kind of precision. 6 hours later, the Institute vessel matched velocity with Sorketh's ship and ran a docking tube, and Mara walked through it with her bag on her shoulder and her field recorder in her hand, and the glyph sphere wrapped in a shirt and nestled between her notebooks. And Director Hasegawa was waiting for her at the other end of the tube with 2 people she didn't recognize who had the flat professional affect of people who spent their careers in rooms without windows. "Dr. Chen," Hasegawa said. "Director," she held out the recorder. 6 hours and 40 minutes. The glyph sphere is in my bag. I want both logged in chain of custody before anyone else handles them." One of the Flatafek people produced a case and opened it without being asked. She liked that. She placed the recorder in it, and then, after a moment, the glyph sphere. The case closed. "Sorketh," she said. "Being received by a separate team," Hasegawa said. "Protected witness protocol as you requested." "Good." She looked at the corridor beyond Hasegawa, standard institute vessel, gray and functional, the faint smell of recycled air that was the background smell of her entire adult life. Something in her chest unclenched very slightly. "Tell me again about the 14. "All alive," Hasegawa said. "As of 4 hours ago, the 3 in critical condition have been upgraded to serious but stable. The others are varying degrees of disoriented. Some are communicating, some aren't yet." "Who's communicating?" "6 of them. The 2 engineers and 4 of the researchers. I want to talk to them." "Mara." "When they're ready, not right now." She looked at Hasegawa. "Osaibansu, the medic, he was there 4 months." "Yes. How is he?" Hasegawa was quiet for a moment. "We don't know yet." She nodded. She thought about the kind of not knowing that was its own answer, and she said it in the same quiet place she'd been setting things all day, and she came back. "The Yelmara data cores," she said. "The cleared room when?" "Tomorrow morning, earliest. They need time to image and catalog before we start pulling from them. I want transaction code 7 Meridian Keth 44 null. It's a deliberately obfuscated buyer record. Harmon Weir's last transaction." "I know who Harmon Weir is," Hasegawa said gently. "I know you do. I'm telling you which code to prioritize when you get into the cores." Hasegawa looked at her for a long moment. She had a way of looking at people. Mara had known her for 11 years, where she was assessing not the surface of what was being said but the structural integrity of the person saying it, the way an engineer looks at a beam and calculates load. "You need to sleep," Hasegawa said. "I know. You've been awake for—" "I know how long I've been awake." She set her bag down on the corridor floor and looked at the director. "2 things. First, the pale entity in the glyph sphere footage. It's not in the Accord registry. It's not a known species. It's the buyer on Harmon's transaction, and it has been operating in the Vethkar fringe for at least 2 years with no contact log, no species classification, and a drive signature nothing in the database recognizes. That needs to be in the briefing for whoever is running the Yelmora operation. Not as a footnote, as a primary concern." "Understood." "Second, Sorketh. I gave a verbal guarantee of protected witness status. I want that in writing before I sleep. I want it documented that the acquisition broker who purchased me out of the Meridian Circuit's queue and transported me to a relay beacon and provided 6 hours of testimony and handed over the only copy of a glyph sphere record documenting 11 months of illegal human acquisition. I want it documented that this individual's cooperation was instrumental and that the protected witness guarantee stands. I'm not negotiating this." Hasegawa looked at her. "I don't negotiate this," Mara said. Sorketh held up its side, I hold up mine. A long pause, then, "I'll have it drafted before you wake up." "Thank you." She picked up her bag, her shoulder ached. Her eyes felt like they were being held open by the sheer weight of everything she still needed to do, and she was aware, distantly, that if she stopped moving she might not start again for some time. "Where am I sleeping?" she said. Hasegawa pointed down the corridor. She walked. She slept for 11 hours, which was 6 more than she'd intended, and when she woke up the vessel had docked at a station she didn't immediately recognize, and there was coffee on the small desk beside her bunk and a sealed document on top of it with Hasegawa's signature block and Sorketh's protected witness guarantee in full. She read it twice, then signed the witness copy, then drank the coffee, and then she picked up her bag and went to find the cleared room. The Yelmara data cores took 3 days to work through. She did not do this alone. There were 3 people from the Flatafek division, who turned out to be named Yusuf, Petra, and someone who went only by Crane, and they were meticulous and fast. And Crane had a facility with Vethkar glyph script that surprised her, until she found out Crane had spent 4 years on the Kepler-12 contact team before moving to whatever the Flatafek division was officially called. Sorketh was made available for consultation through a secured audio link. Not in the room, which seemed to be a compromise everyone found acceptable, and answered questions with the same careful precision it had maintained throughout. Transaction code 7 Meridian Keth 44 null was in the core. The null suffix had been applied from the buyer's side. As Sorketh had said, a system-level encryption that shouldn't have been accessible to a non-circuit party, which told them that whoever the pale entity was, it had either purchased access to the circuit's administrative layer or had found a way to insert itself into it from outside. Both options implied capabilities that were, in Yusuf's careful language, above what they'd been working with as assumptions. The transaction record itself was intact. Harmon Weir, classified as Acquisition 7 Meridian 14, transferred to buyer, destination flagged as transit in progress, no final delivery confirmation logged. Transit in progress. She stared at that for a long time. Transit in progress means he was moved but not delivered, she said. Which means either the delivery point wasn't logged because the buyer didn't trust the circuit's records, or the transit was still ongoing when the circuit's logging system last updated. Or, Petra said carefully, the buyer intended to encrypt the delivery record after completion, but hadn't done so yet when the facility was secured. What's the timestamp on the last circuit log update? Crane checked, 6 days before the facility was secured. She did the math. So if the transit started more than 6 days before the facility went offline, then Harmon Weir was moved more than 6 days ago, Yusuf said. And wherever he went, the record of it was going to be encrypted by a buyer who uses null suffix obfuscation and a drive signature we can't track. She looked at the transaction record for a long time. Then she opened her notebook to the page where she'd written, Harmon buyer unknown, transaction linked to pale entity, find buyer, find Harmon, and under it she wrote, transit in progress, 6-day window minimum, delivery unconfirmed. She underlined it once. The drive signature, she said, from Sorketh's account. Is there any data in the cores that cross-references it, even partially? 3 days of searching produced a partial match. It wasn't a drive signature in the conventional sense. It was a navigational echo, the kind left in transit corridor monitoring data, a ghost in the system that navigation buoys recorded automatically without anyone having specifically designed them to catch it. The Orvon Exchange had 3 navigational buoys in its approach corridor. 2 of them had logged an anomalous echo on the same night as Sorketh's second sighting of the pale entity. The echo's vector pointed outward, away from the Kepler-12 system, away from the Accord's established transit corridors, into a region that the Accord's navigation charts marked as uncharted territory, not empty space, just uncharted. The kind of region that hadn't been cataloged because no one had had reason to go there yet. Someone had reason. She sat in the cleared room on the evening of the 3rd day and looked at the navigational chart on the display and thought about Harmon Weir and his daughter in the paper crown, and the transaction code that ended in null, and the direction a pale entity had been going when it left the known edge of the Accord. This is where the next case starts, she said. Yusuf, who was packing up for the night, looked at her. Are you already thinking about the next case? I never stopped thinking about the next case, she said. The next case is Harmon. Yusuf was quiet for a moment. Then, Dr. Chen, you've been in this room for 3 days on no real sleep. You recovered 14 people from an illegal facility. You turned a hostile acquisition into a cooperative witness. You built a case that is, as of this morning, being briefed to 3 government bodies simultaneously, and has already resulted in 2 Vethkar government officials being recalled pending investigation. You did all of this while being, technically, a missing person. Yes, she said. Maybe take a day. She looked at him. She thought about what he was saying and why he was saying it, and she understood that it was kindness, and she accepted the kindness, and then she turned back to the navigational chart. "The uncharted region," she said. "Does the Accord have any survey missions scheduled for it?" Yusuf sighed. "I'll check in the morning." She nodded. She looked at the chart. The pale entity had gone somewhere. Harmon had gone with it, transit in progress, delivery unconfirmed. Somewhere beyond the edge of the charts, something she had no name for was moving through space that no Accord vessel had logged, carrying a human xenolinguist and the specific knowledge of language and translation that a xenolinguist carried, and the question of why it needed that, why it specifically wanted a human who could decode communication structures, was one she was not going to stop thinking about until she had an answer. She knew what it felt like to stand in front of an unlocked door. She knew what it felt like to go back through it. The corridor beyond this particular door was 12 light-years of uncharted space, and a navigational echo and a transaction code, and a pale thing that didn't speak and didn't register, and moved through the galaxy like a question no one had thought to ask yet. She was going to ask it. She gathered her notebooks and her field recorder, and the copy of the protected witness guarantee, and the photograph of Elliot, which she'd been keeping in the front pocket of her bag where it wouldn't get crumpled, and she walked out of the cleared room and down the corridor to the small mess where the coffee was always on, and where she found, unexpectedly, Sorketh. The Vethkar broker was sitting at a table in the corner, sitting, because the chairs in the mess were human-sized, and it had to fold itself with a care that was somehow both awkward and dignified, with something in front of it that was not quite food, a small container of something the color of cooling amber that it held between two claw-tipped fingers without drinking. It looked at her with all four eyes. "You should be sleeping," it said. "You're not sleeping either. I do not sleep the way you do. I enter a rest state that requires less time and less privacy." It looked at the amber container. "I was thinking." She pulled out the chair across from it and sat down. "About what?" "About what comes next," Sorketh said. "I have completed my witness obligations. I have given testimony. I have been told that the protected status holds. I am," a pause, "in an unusual position." "You're free to go," she said. "Yes, and yet." It set down the amber container, the pale entity, the uncharted region, the transaction code. She looked at it. "I have been thinking," Sorketh said, "about what I told you, that I have seen it twice, that both times I left as quickly as I could manage." It was quiet for a moment. The scales on its chest moved slowly. "I have been thinking that I should not have left." "Why?" "Because I am a very good tracker," Sorketh said simply. "I find things. It is what I do. I found you. I found the circuit. I found records that 11 months of enforcement had missed entirely." A pause. "I left the pale entity twice because it frightened me, but I left without following, and your colleague was taken while I was not following." She was quiet. "I am not responsible for Dr. Weir," Sorketh said. It did not sound like it was trying to convince her. It sounded like it was trying to be precise. "I was not in that position. I did not make that choice. But I am aware that I have capabilities that are relevant to finding him, and that I am currently in a position of unusual cooperation with human authorities, and that the navigational echo from the Orvan exchange points in a direction I have heard referred to before." "You've heard of the uncharted region." "Not as a region, as a name. In the circuit's peripheral records, the ones that were not in the glyph sphere that Crane found in the cores, there is a designation, used only twice in the full record, for whatever is in that direction." Sorketh looked at her. "It is not a place name. In Tradeglyph it reads as a transaction category." She leaned forward. "What's the category?" "The translation is not precise," Sorketh said, "but the closest rendering in your language is beyond management." She sat with that. Beyond management. A transaction category, used twice in the records of an illegal human acquisition network, pointing in the same direction as a pale entity with an unregistered drive signature, and a human xenolinguist it had purchased and taken somewhere the Accords charts didn't go. I think, she said slowly, that I need to talk to Hasegawa again. Yes, Sorketh said, and I think you are going to tell her that you want a vessel. She looked at the Vethkar broker across the table, four-eyed, still slightly hunched even in a chair, scales moving in that slow water ripple pattern she decided to read as the closest thing it had to comfort. I'm going to tell her I want a vessel, she said, and a tracker. Sorketh was quiet for a moment. The protected witness status, it said, would remain in place. Whatever comes next is voluntary. Another pause. The amber container sat between its fingers. Outside the small porthole set into the mess wall, the stars were the same stars they'd always been, the ones that had been there the night she decided to walk back through a door, and the night before that, and every night of every year of her life up to now. The Orvan Exchange has certain contacts I still maintain, Sorketh said, people who track movement in the fringe, who know which corridors see traffic that doesn't file transit plans, who may have seen the pale entity pass through. A pause. These contacts do not speak to humans. They barely speak to me. But I have dealt with them honestly for 11 years, which is a longer streak of honesty than most of what passes through that market. That's useful, she said. Yes. Is that a yes? Sorketh looked at her. All four amber depths. You came back through the door, it said, for the third time since they'd met. You keep saying that. I keep saying it because I keep not being done with it, Sorketh said. In my experience, in 31 years of operating in the fringe, in the gray market, in the spaces between legality and necessity, beings do not come back through unlocked doors. They run. Every time. It is the rational choice. You are aware of this. Yes. And yet you keep choosing differently. Yes. Sorketh was still for a long moment. Then I will keep choosing to be on the same side of the door as you, it said. Since that side appears to be where the interesting things happen. She looked at the Vethkar broker for a long moment, and then she looked down at her notebook, and then she opened it to the back page and looked at the single entry there, Harmon Weir. Transaction code, pale entity, find buyer, find Harmon. She had the transaction code. She had a tracker with fringe contacts. She had a navigational echo pointed toward a region the Accords charts called Uncharted, and the circuit's records called Beyond Management. She had something worth going toward. She turned to a new page and started writing. This time she wasn't building a case. This time she was building a plan.